Thank you very much. And with this, I welcome everyone to today's Nexus Seminar. So I think there's still a couple of people arriving, so I'll give it a few seconds, and then I'll get officially started. But I wanted to welcome everyone to the Nexus Seminar. Just as a reminder, the Nexus Seminar is co-hosted by UNU Flores, so that's the United Nations University Institute for Integrated Management and Material Fluxes of Resources, together with my colleague, Professor Serena Katsia, and together with the Dresden University of Technology, so TUD, and particularly PRISMA, the Center for Sustainability Assessment and Policy. My name is N.83 Silva, and I'm the Karlovitz Junior Professor for Sustainability Assessment and Policy. And together with my co-host Serena, I am delighted to welcome all of you today, and particularly Ignas Bruder. So some background on information on the seminar. The Nexus Seminar series was established by the two institutions in 2015, so it's been running for a while, and it features speakers, particularly senior researchers, around the topic of sustainability and the resource nexus. Today we have the 83rd edition, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Ignas Bruder in just a moment. Before we start, a brief orientation for the participants in today's sessions. Usually the speaker provides insights into their work at the beginning. And if you have any topical questions for the speaker that come up during the presentation, you can post them in the Q&A session. So that's a question and answer section. And then Serena and I will moderate the discussion session after the presentation. And then we will ask your questions after the presentation to the speaker. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please don't use the Q&A session, but the regular chat function, and then you'll reach the colleagues behind the scenes who are currently facilitating the session. So without further ado, I'm glad to introduce today's speaker, Professor Ignas Bruder. Ignas pursued his bachelor's, master's, and PhD at Free University Berlin. His PhD focused on essays on social entrepreneurship and sustainable organizing, an ethically focused practice-based perspective, and was supervised by Yoxido. He then spent his postdoc at Hertie School, where he was part of the Europe Horizon Project Rebalance, which focuses on rebalancing democracy and capitalism. And then Ignas joined us here at TUD as a junior professor last August. And in the short time that he's been here, he spent some time as a visiting researcher at Copenhagen Business School, as well as more recently at the University of Oxford. And his work has been published in Organization Studies, Journal of Management Studies, and the Journal of Business Ethics, among others. I'm really very excited that you are joining us today, Ignas, and I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, and I would like to hand the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very, very excited to be here. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks a lot for the very warm introduction. I'll be speaking today about organizational sustainability and why I think that it is a question of the normativity in daily practices. This presentation is going to be based on two works. One is a working paper with my great colleagues Julia Bartosz and Jörg Zido, and another one is a paper published last year together with Jörg Zido that has a more stronger inter-organizational perspective. But both of these studies came from the same case, so I thought it would be interesting to give you a little bit of a background story of how this came about and what I think these two studies have to say on the topic. So I will be very briefly just talking about my research interests, so you have kind of an idea who I am as a researcher and why am I doing what I'm doing. Then I'll go into some clarifications of foundational questions that I think are important to be able to follow this combination of perhaps strange research interests I have and why I do these things in the way I do them. And then we'll do a deep dive into practice-based research of organizational sustainability based on these two studies. And mainly, I will be talking about interesting outcomes of these studies. So I don't want to bore you with methods, but of course, if your method's interested, I'm very happy to pick up the question of methodology later on in the discussion. And then I hope we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions. So I'll try to keep myself short. while being aware that I am a notorious long speaker. So let's see how this turns out. My research questions center on basically these three areas. One of them being societal transformation as a phenomenon, right? So how do we get sustainability transitions on the way, for instance? How do we get important transformative processes underway that are needed in society? Theoretically, I'm on the one hand very interested in business ethics, and for the business ethics aficionados among the listeners, I work with the approach of integrative ethics, which is closely connected to the St. Gallen School of Business Ethics. So it's a deontological ethics, kind of an ethical critical stance towards business theories rooted in discourse ethics. And I work a lot with theories of practice, which one could say are grand social theories, almost social ontologies coming from sociology. And I'm really interested, especially in the intersections of these. So ethical questions in relation to practices, for instance, practice of societal transformation, but also ethical reflection of societal transformation efforts, and so on and so forth. Of course, I also do some other things, but then anything I do is basically related to one of the three, and sometimes even my research hits the bullseye of the overlap of these three fields. So much about myself and my research interests. And now let's clarify some of these foundational questions. So, what are practices? Practices are socially shared patterns of action that are relatively stable across time and space. So this is a definition by Anthony Giddens that I like to work with, because it's quite broad and flexible. And I would like to stress this socially shared aspect, right, and the relative stability across time and space. So this implies that a practice is not simply individual activity, right? So it's not about what an individual does, but these practices, they are deeply social and also culturally shared patterns. And this social and culturally shared aspect of them is really the centerpiece of this theoretical sensitivity, right? I like to say that practices reside on a supra-individual level, right? So it's not in the hands of individuals to change how a practice goes, right? So I'll give you an example, also from my own life. Playing basketball is a practice, and playing basketball, of course, you participate in this practice if you want to play basketball. It is socially shared, a socially shared pattern, right? There are many basketball players in the world. It is relatively stable across space and time, right? So if you play basketball somewhere in Asia or somewhere in South America, it's pretty much similar to the basketball they play here in Germany. Yet, among the relative stability, the game changed over the decades a little bit, right? So there is some change there, and it's not up for grabs for me as an individual to change how basketball is played, right? It is a culturally shared thing. It is a deeply social thing. So kind of these changes, they happen, and we cannot single-handedly say now basketball is going to be played differently, right? Another example is cooking, for instance. Cooking practices have been around since society has been formed, and there's also of course, in this practice, variance, like there's different local cuisines, but there's also some similarities and some central tenets of what it means to cook a meal, right? And these two being rather kind of daily practice examples, of course, there are lots of work practices and management practices in the organizations that we're all part of, and especially the organizations we study. And there you also have specific shared patterns of action that are relatively stable across space and time. That is not for an individual to kind of influence how this goes, but especially in larger organizations, this is more of an organizational thing. And of course, top management tries to steer it, but sometimes practices have a bit of a life of their own, and this is not possible to any extent. So now you might wonder, what is normative about practices? Because in the title we had the normativity of practices. And here, let me start with that the normativity inherent in practice is not explicit. So usually when we think of normativity, we think of explicit rule-bound prescriptions. And it's very important for me to underscore that normativity also has a very implicit nature. Normativity, as in the work of Habermas, it can be implicit in language, and practice theory stresses the aspect that normativity is inherent in practices and it is implicit in practices. And let me explain you what I mean with this. So there are distinctions between correct and incorrect, or appropriate and inappropriate performances of a practice. And the normativity of a practice lies exactly in these distinctions. So this is like one aspect where this implicit normativity is there, right? So it is not necessarily explicit rule-bound prescriptions per se, but it's more like, no, if you do it like this, this is not right, or like this is not the way it goes. Kind of this very internalized, taken for granted kind of distinctions of how you do things. The other aspect is kind of the oddness and acceptability regarding the ends a practice may pursue. So this is very present in Techatsky's work on practices. That practices have, he calls them normativized ends that have a kind of an oddness or acceptability. So if you participate in the practice, then there are some certain ends that you ought to pursue, or some ends that are acceptable to be pursued with this practice, and other ends that are not really acceptable ends if you engage in this particular practice. So if we come back to the example of basketball, for instance, so for me as a basketball player, like if I see somebody throwing a free throw in a strange way, I'd be like, no, this is not how you throw a free throw, right? Like you would not throw like a one-handed hook shot from the free throw line, for instance. This would be an incorrect performance of the practice, right? So even this kind of sense beyond kind of the rules of the game of basketball, right? There's the leeway. Anybody can throw free throws the way they want, but like you can tell if somebody knows how to play basketball, they know how to throw a free throw, and if they throw it strangely, then that person is potentially not very knowledgeable of the practice, right? It will be considered a rather inappropriate performance of the practice. The example of cooking, I think, if you think of Italians and their position on how to cook pasta, for instance, there you see kind of this very, very clear normativity that there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it, right? And so by this distinguishing between this correct and incorrect performance of the practice, this is where basically the normativity inherent in the practice comes to the foreground. And also in these organizational contexts, the normativity of a practice might surface, for instance, in distinctions regarding strategic decisions, right? In one organization, it might be considered a correct performance of the practice to involve many also shop floor employees in decision making, also in strategic decision making, because they think these people are really close to the market and we need to summon their knowledge and expertise in decision making. In other organizations, this would be considered an inappropriate performance of a strategy making practice, because there's an ivory tower of top. Excellent. Can you see the screen?
Yes. So you're all
Okay.
back online. Perfect.
Great. So yeah, just to round up, there's differences in the normativity even of one and the same practice across space and time, and in different organizations, things might be performed differently, and also the idea of how is it right to perform a certain practice might differ considerably. And you might ask, yeah, but why is this important? So why look at practices if you're interested in sustainability and as in my case, especially organizational sustainability? I would say in relation to organization sustainability, the practices of an organization are really the crux. Why do I think that? Well, think of greenwashing or decoupling, for instance, right? So these are cases where organizations only pretend to do something they are actually not doing. So you say, yeah, we're a very green company and we do all these great things, but actually the business as usual is not as green as they make it appear, or they do it to a much lesser extent than communicated, right? And I mean, there's lots of research on greenwashing and all of these legitimacy facades of organizations. And so if you research the practices, you research what they actually are doing. Yeah. So researching the practices means looking behind the discursive facade of an organization. And so organizations can tell you lots of great things, but then the question is, well, how sustainable is this what they're doing, right? So I would say, to what extent an organization is contributing to a sustainable treatment of the environment or a socially responsible treatment of humans is a question of its practices. So if you can grab an organization by its practices, so to speak, you basically have a very clear idea of what's actually happening there. So I would say any organization can only be as sustainable as the practices constituting it. So this is already a quite strong perspective, as you might have noticed, because I would say organizations are constituted by the practices that they engage in, and this is what makes up an organization, in my opinion. So, having clarified now what practices are, what's normative about them, and why look at practices if you're interested in sustainability, let me clarify one other foundational question, and this is, what are social enterprises? Because social enterprises are an organizational form that I engage in quite a lot, and that I would say also have a certain relevance in relation to sustainability questions. So social enterprises are a hybrid between a business enterprise and a non-profit organization. What do I mean by that? So social enterprises take different elements from these two archetypes of organizations and combine them in a new way. So social enterprises pursue societal goals. Usually you would speak of a social mission, such as non-profit organizations. But non-profit organizations are usually funded through philanthropy, right? But social enterprises, they pursue these societal goals by engaging in business activities, such as regular enterprises, right? So we have kind of so social enterprises have also the ambition to engage in ethical, legitimate practices. And this is something I've seen empirically. It's not so much in the scientific discourse. There you would speak mostly of what makes them social is their social mission. My point here is that, well, they also have practices that can live up to the normative validity claim of being social. That means kind of being an ethically legitimate enterprise in their practices. And very often social enterprises are equipped with a socially innovative approach, right? So I have another insight that this implies coping with tensions. So if you're this type of hybrid organization, if you don't fall into one of these classical categories, then tensions are particularly strong, especially if you're doing business, then, well, you have the necessity to survive economically, right? You have to make ends meet, you need to generate income. And at the same time, this might be in tension with advances regarding your social goals, because maybe in order to make more money, you have less capacity to go about your social goals with the same intensity as you would have, right? Or if you have more resources, then things get easier. So what are examples of such social enterprises? One of them is Ecosia. You might know it. It is a search engine with a mission to kind of contribute to reforestation, thereby fighting the climate crisis, and they do this with business activity with a search engine that they're running, right? Another example that is less known, but I think kind of shows another approach to social enterprise in a very, very strong way is Discovering Hands. So Discovering Hands is a German social enterprise with the mission to bring blind women integrate them into the job market. Because for disabled people, it's often, or people with disabilities, it is often difficult to find employment. And what Discovering Hands does is they do teaching courses for blind women to be able to detect breast cancer with their tactile senses, and they can detect it even much better than very well-trained gynecologists who can see because the tactile senses are not as strong, right? So this is a very socially innovative approach, right? And they sell this training service, and they also sell orientation stickers to be used during these screenings. And so this is just another example of a more kind of integrated social enterprise approach and what these social enterprises are doing. And these are types of organizations that I'm very interested in my research. And also the research I'll be talking about is based on a social enterprise. So now you have more or less a clue of what I'm talking about when I mean social enterprises. And so when I went into the field to do field work, I did a single case study with the logic of a revelatory case study, right? To find a rather extreme case that is kind of as revealing as possible. Kind of the question that was very striking to me was to understand, well, these social enterprises, they have this very strong focus on non-economic aspects regarding their goals, regarding their practices, but at the same time, they have to survive in competitive markets, right? And very often, like in direct competition between social enterprise, think of Ecosia and Google, for instance. Google can just use the income they generate in order kind of to generate even more income, and Ecosia use the income they generate in order to plant trees, right? So there is already a competitive disadvantage if you focus on these social things, and still, well, how do you do it then? Like how do you cope with these disadvantages in competitive markets with your social focus? How does this work? This was what I was interested in, and I was looking for kind of an organization that was as strong as possible on these non-economic aspects. That was kind of not really doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but really kind of honing in fully on the social and environmental goals. So the case that I looked at is pseudonymized with nature costs in my research. It is a social enterprise producing natural cosmetics in Germany, and they've been operating for over 40 years. So they were one of the pioneers in Germany regarding natural cosmetics. And interestingly, they, from the companies that were around at that time, this kind of foundational period of natural cosmetics, either those who still exist today, either they became large, like rather large multinational companies, or they vanished, and this one just stayed small. So this is already one kind of interesting observation. Like they just remained small. And in 2024, they had less than 20 employees. And why did they remain small? Well, economic growth was never considered important to them. So the focus there was always also historically more on feminism, more on environmental protection, and more on being kind of as sustainable as possible, and not necessarily on growing as much as possible at the cost of these other values that were very valued more than economic aspects. So this organization has an exceptionally strong sustainability focus. They're very strongly focused on veganism, very strict on this. Environmental protection is a very strong thing. Fairness is a very strong value throughout the whole supply chain. And later I'll give you an example where you can see what I mean by that. And the social enterprise aspect is that they're operating a women's shelter in an African country, which is like one thing that they finance through their income, and also they're sustaining direct fair trade relationships with suppliers in the global south. So their policy is as many fair trade ingredients as possible, and then also not only certified fair trade, but also direct fair trade relationships to farmers in the global south for key ingredients. They are certified according to the highest European natural cosmetics standard, and they are also owner operated without any debt capital. So that means all investments are financed from cash flow, and this is already an important boundary condition. So they're owner operated, they don't have any debt capital, and the owner is a sustainability enthusiast. And so compared to other companies, they don't really necessarily have to earn a profit above covering their costs, right? So if you have any debt capital, you have to pay an interest on the debt capital. If you have investors who want to see a certain return on investment, you have to kind of gain more than you put in. And here, the setup is in a way that they can focus on sustainability, and the economic side of things is cover the expenses you have, and then we're fine, which makes things easier. And regarding their production and other services that need to go into the product, they're operating in a network approach with long-standing suppliers for services. However, they are remaining in charge of the raw material purchases. So this is also a very exotic constellation, because usually the logic of outsourcing is the logic of reducing complexity, right? You would, I don't know.
I think we're having another connectivity break, but we're just hoping that Ignas will be back in a minute.
Out.
So he's just connecting back. You're back, Ignas. Perfect. Do you want to
Yeah,
share your
yes, yeah, yeah. Now I even recognize when I have to stop speaking. So I think you didn't miss anything.
Perfect.
Just
It
a
was just
moment.
a few seconds.
Yeah, just a moment to breathe during my monologue. So
Thanks. Back to you.
yeah. So yeah, this is basically the setup. This is the type of organization I was looking at, and now let's deep dive into the practices. So first of all, like what types of practices did we find? How do the practices of NatureCos look like? We found three categories of practices internally. One of them we call people and planet oriented values practices. So these practices, they have kind of there is explicit normativity. So these practices are supposed to establish the high normative status of social and environmental concerns. The practices we identified were, on the one hand, setting distinct priorities. So it's kind of a practice of setting priorities. I'll show you an example in a second of, this is important here at this organization. And the other one is challenging the status quo. So challenging the status quo is kind of challenging anything that would be considered not sustainable enough, and thereby kind of establishing that sustainability is the most important thing here. Now, let me give you an example of setting distinct priorities from the data. I'll just read it out. If I drop out, I'll continue. So Mike, office management, Stacy, marketing, and Maggie, operations, talk about their impressions of the Friday for Future protest. Paul, an external IT provider, joins the conversation by saying that he saw other firms closing their online shops for a few hours and that this may be sufficient next time instead of taking Nature Co's online shop offline for 24 hours. Laura replies that this is exactly the purpose of it, the climate strike, and that we can really afford it at the moment. It's 1,000 euros that we lose, she adds. Paul answers, exactly. It's 1,000 and 1,000 euros, and one can also take a stand without necessarily losing revenue. Mike comments that this will be greenwashing. Laura adds that the main idea behind it is to lose revenue. Peter raises his arm slightly, defending himself. I just wanted to point it out. So what happens here? This external IT provider, I would say in many other businesses, if somebody makes a suggestion how you can save some money, anybody would be say, hey, great idea, welcome, thanks for chipping in and thinking along. And here people are, no, climate strike is about losing revenue. If you don't do the strike and lose revenue, then it's just symbolic. Here it's about really showing that we're strike. People, you cannot buy our products because it's climate strike. And kind of very, very strongly setting distinct priorities. No. It's not about $1,000. It's about supporting the climate strike, right? So this is like one of these examples of these people and planet-oriented values practices. Now, the other practice bundle, we call them normatively oscillating practices. And I don't have an example for this because this is what you would find, I would say, usually in organizations that try to be more sustainable. So these practices, like their normativity oscillates between social and environmental concerns and then economic demands, right? So of course you try to be more sustainable, but then you have like economic things to consider. So you prioritize economic demands ahead of some sustainable considerations, but then again, at a later point, you come back to the sustainable considerations. So for instance, we have data on kind of modifying existing products that they're kind of downsize some of the packages in order to increase revenues. Of course, if you downsize packages, that means there's more waste created. It's a negative sustainability impact. But then when they downsize it, they found a supplier for recycled materials for the packaging. So then it's again back to the environmental, and kind of it's oscillating back and forth. And I would say this is something that is not that unusual. I think one can see that in a lot of organizations. And this is the particularly interesting thing about this case, we found what we call normatively prioritizing practices. So these are practices that normatively prioritize social and environmental concerns ahead of economic ones throughout. Like in the data, we didn't have any instance of these practices where these practices would be, I don't know, let's go more for the economic thing in this case, like it was in the normatively oscillating practices. And these are very, very key business practices like selling products or managing supplier relations. And let me give you some data to illustrate how these practices look. So this is a narrative from the CEO owner, and he says about negotiations with a retail firm that offered them very good terms. So he recounts, and so we went there. On the one hand, the typical procurement managers were sitting there, but next to them, there was a very elegant man from top management, where the procurement managers had no say. It was he alone who was negotiating and deciding on the terms. And when we asked, what about the terms? He said, that's not important. What we want is you as big and as green as possible in our stores. We want the customers to enter the store and see the green beacon. This is what we want you for. He put it in a nutshell so glaringly. Nobody had ever put it that clearly. For me, a lot became obvious in that moment. We said, we are not doing it. We don't want to do it if we are used for marketing and greenwashing purposes. Right? So this is an instance of their sales where what they do is very regularly reject customer requests. And this is somewhat paradoxical. Usually your salespeople want to make deals, right? They're not about rejecting customer requests. And in that organization's sales is really now selling to them will be not sustainable. We reject this request, and they do it a lot. Not only, but this is the very particularly telling example, right? So why is this somewhat paradoxical? Well, if you reject all customer requests, you have to close close down your organization because you don't make any revenue, right? But so you have to accept some customer requests in order to reject others. And then in other cases, they say, well, there is this other retail chain there. We can see that they really try kind of to increase the range of organic products. They really make an effort. So this is then an organization when they say, okay, it's cool to sell our products to them. And like it, if it's like in this, where they say this retail chain, they don't seem to care at all about sustainability. They want us basically to greenwash their stores. The CEO owner also used the expression at one point where he said, like, if they just want us to sell more of their other shitty products, then we don't do it. So this is an example from selling. Another example from managing supplier relations. There it's not so much on the environmental, but more on the social side. There also social concerns are always ahead. And I've brought you an email from the CEO to the organization, where it's discussing about kind of the costs for a certain supplier who's producing the tags for them. So he's writing, "Dear friends, I agreed with TagHop on an overall temporary price increase of 20%, which lasts until March 31st, 2020. The old prices will apply again thereafter. By then, TagHop wants to invest in a new machine that will produce our quality more economically. The actual additional costs, according to TagHop, are 52%. In that light, the agreement is a good one. Nevertheless, it will cost us 10 to 15,000 euros, but this is an issue of fair treatment of suppliers." So the background is that because NatureCost doesn't use any overpackaging because they say it's unnecessary waste, the product tags are really important, and they don't want any like difference in the color between different batches. So that means that the tag producer needs to do a lot of test prints in order to get the color exactly right.
I think we're encountering another connectivity issue, but hopefully Ignas will be back in a second.
And this just creates additional with the machinery they had.
Yes, you're back.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, now I have the message that my internet connection is not stable. Okay, we'll see what happens.
Perfect. But
Yeah.
screen is still there, you're still there, so that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah. The screen is still sharing. Cool. So here we also see an example of basically fairness before profit orientation in this organization. And now the question is, how are these kind of very exotic practices being sustained and enabled, especially in the context of these like this tension I spoke in the beginning? You have these economic demands that you have to meet, but you also have the social and environmental concerns that you care a lot about, right? And so what came out of our research is that, well, these social and environmental concerns, they of course inform these people and planet-oriented values practices that we identified. These values practices, in turn, they infuse these normatively oscillating practices with this sustainability orientation, that these environmental and social aspects, that they are important. And then these normatively oscillating practices, well, they partly favor social and environmental concerns, and they partly facilitate meeting economic demands. And I would say in many organizations, this will be the end of the story. But here, in the case of NatureCost, we also have these normatively prioritizing practices. And these normatively prioritizing practices, well, they're also infused with kind of this normativity of going for social and environmental concerns by the values practices. And these normatively prioritizing practices, they continuously favor the social and environmental concerns. And we noticed something during the study, that this continuous favoring of social and environmental concerns and kind of never putting them behind economic interests, it creates a side effect. One could say potentially even an unintended side effect. It brings about what we call sustainability enablers. So this very strange approach to selling creates a strong negotiating position in the market, and this very fairness-oriented approach to supplier management creates obligation-based reciprocity on the side of suppliers. And the special thing about these, what we call sustainability enablers, is that they help meet economic demands without having to compromise on social and environmental concerns. So in relation to the selling practice, for instance, once you reject quite a few customer requests, and once you're kind of doing this in a very, very thorough way, you get the image that like these are the serious sustainability guys. And then if some retail chain wants to create kind of a natural cosmetics section, for instance, they know that, well, for a natural cosmetics section to be credible, we kind of need them in there. So they're more willing to give good conditions than in other cases. And with the suppliers, of course, if you treat suppliers fairly, they're very, very open to reciprocate, right? And the supplier tech corp, where they shared basically investment costs with that supplier, is also happy to help out if Nature Cost has a rough patch in the future, right? And so these sustainability enablers, they facilitate meeting economic demands, and then the decreased economic pressure through the sustainability enablers, well, this enables them to cultivate these normatively prioritizing practices in the first place. So we see there is a circular dynamic that is kind of enabling itself with this strong sustainability focus. And let me give you some examples regarding these sustainability enablers. So the sales manager, Giselle, recounts about the negotiation for the biggest deal they had with a drugstore chain. She says, I think I said 5% discount on the invoice straight away. I mean, it was the cheapest deal we ever got. I made the offer and they said, okay, fine, straight away, without any discussion, without bargaining. Now you might think, well, 5% discount, is this such a good deal? What you have to know is that in Germany, retail is very, very concentrated and thus very powerful. And usually retailers, if they list a new a new brand, a new provider, the retailer asks them for their prices, and then usually the retailers want at least 20% discount on the original price. This is kind of the minimum. If you get, like in most cases, especially small producers, they have to pay 20% discount, and this is only 5% discount. So this is really, really above average. Another example regarding the obligation-based reciprocity from suppliers, and this is from field notes. Once a supplier approached us and said, now that we have produced so much, we can make it cheaper because he has cheaper options for larger quantities and would find it unfair if you continued to pay high prices. It does not happen all the time and it's rather the exception, but stuff like that happens as well, says George. Right? So this is one of these cases where the suppliers, they get treated fairly, and at some point the suppliers, they feel this obligation-based reciprocity. Well, now producing for them is cheaper for me. I would find it unfair to keep all the margin for myself. I want to share that with these guys because they have been fair with me as well, right? And so this is kind of the first part of our explanation. How are these practices being sustained? Because these practices, they are rather unconventional, and we would say that these dynamics, they make it possible to sustain them. And regarding the relations to suppliers, we noticed when speaking to these suppliers that there is more than that. There is this obligation-based reciprocity that Nature Cost treats them fairly and they treat them fairly back. But there were also other instances where it was not necessarily Nature Cost doing them a favor, and still these suppliers were very, very, very supportive to a degree that you would not expect, because these suppliers are all regular businesses in the cosmetics supplying industry, right? And so we wanted to dig a little deeper there on that side. So we conducted quite a few interviews, and we also analyzed additional documents and emails sent back and forth between suppliers and NatureCos. And this is this other study. So the second part of how are the practices being sustained and enabled now looks at NatureCos as the focused social enterprise, or we call it purpose-oriented organization, and collaborating organizations. And we look at inter-organizational practices. And we look at the kind of the practices that NatureCos engages in, and then the practices that collaborating organizations engage in. And so we already have established that NatureCos has this normative aspiration for purpose before profit, and that purpose is a very sustainability oriented one, of course. And then we identified two interorganizational practices that we call purpose work. So purpose work means, on the one hand, communicating to your suppliers that you have a purpose priority, because these suppliers, they have a lot of cosmetic customers, and usually cosmetic firms are just regular businesses. And for a cosmetic producing firm, they are different, so they have to explain, hey guys, first of all, for us it's about sustainability, for us it's not about business. So this is the communicating. And the second thing is, of course, enacting this purpose priority in the direct interactions with these suppliers. So basically walking the talk, right? This is what the practice perspective sensitizes us to look at. And this purpose work then can bring about what we call purpose borrowing, which is kind of a complex of practices, of three different practices that kind of happen in a sequential order. I'll walk you through them. So what happens in purpose borrowing? Well, first of all, the collaborating organization senses that the focal organization, NatureCos, that there is this purpose priority and what this priority is about. And I have an example for you from a supplier that illustrates this vividly. So the supplier is a toll manufacturer for waterless products, and the CEO of that supplier said, at NatureCos, they actually live for sustainability, and it's not primarily an ostensible reason to increase revenue. For example, when we talk about the products, for some enterprises, it is only about them looking sustainable, but whether they really are sustainable is less important to them. And this is where I have to say that I get the impression with NatureCos that they really live for it, because they actually put sustainable solutions into practice. Of course, the suppliers, they can see if a customer is only doing kind of a legitimacy facade of pretending to be sustainable, or if they say, no, we go for this most sustainable solution regarding the things that you're supplying, right? So kind of nobody can look as well behind the facade of an organization as the suppliers, because they get kind of the orders what to supply and what not to supply. So after sensing that focal organization's purpose priority, the next step is sympathizing with the focal organization's purpose. Of course, not all of them sympathize with it, but quite a few do. And here's a quote from this IT service provider that we had in the other example, who suggested to maybe not close down the shop during climate strike for 24 hours, but a little shorter. And he's saying that something I didn't know initially was that the two owners and CEOs at that time pursued this with an incredible sincerity. I quickly realized that they were not doing it to make money, but because they wanted to do just exactly that, follow a social purpose. They paid attention to the credit-to-credit principle and made sure that the packaging, including the product tags, were reasonably produced. And then, at some point, I identified with it. It did not take long until I was somehow proud to play a part in such an endeavor. And this is something that we see among quite a few suppliers. They are proud to be supplying for such a customer, because among their regular customers, they just do business, and here this one, sustainability purpose. Wow, cool! This is something special, and also authentic sustainability purpose. No greenwashing, but actually the real thing. Cool! How great is it to contribute with my services to this type of endeavor? And then So this, of course, only happens if there's an openness to non-economic considerations within the collaborating organization. If the collaborating organization is only about money, 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 of course they won't care much about the purpose priority. They say, yeah, whatever, But there are some who are of course open to non-economic considerations, especially sustainability considerations, and so then the sympathizing can take place. And then there is a transition. So if you sympathize with your collaborating partners, the focal organization's purpose, then some organizations start to advance the focal organization's purpose themselves. And this is what we mean by purpose borrowing. These for-profit businesses, business-to-business suppliers start to do very extraordinary stuff in order to support the sustainability purpose of nature cause. We have tons of examples for this. I'll just give you one that I think is quite vivid. So how does this look? For instance, this is their tax consultant doing the tax declarations for them and the bookkeeping. So he said, and regarding the women's shelter, I can tell you, now we do the reports and all those things for them without billing them for that. Because I said to the owner, you know what? You better paint a room in the women's shelter. I mean, buy some paint for it rather than paying our bills. Or I don't know what they need over there. Maybe you could buy them a radio or 5 radios or more food or something. And then it's okay, I think. I would say this is not your usual tax consultant. Tax consultants don't have the image of being the people doing stuff for free, at least in my perception. But for this tax consultant, doing something for free for this customer is a purposeful endeavor, right? So that boundary spanner, that tax consultant, is kind of borrowing the purpose of nature cost and acting on behalf of this other organization's purpose in order to support it. And this, of course, happens mostly if there's an absence of an own social purpose, because social purpose-oriented organizations usually are struggling enough themselves, so they don't simply have capacity to do stuff for free, for instance, for others. And especially if you don't have a social purpose of your own in your organization.
I think there might be another connectivity issue, and I'm hoping Ignas is going to be back in a second. So we'll just give it a second until Ignas is reconnecting.
So if you're producing tags, which is
and Ignas
fine, shall I just continue? I'm back. Cool. Yeah.
Perfect. It's on text
So,
still. So
yeah, excellent. And so if you have suppliers who are acting kind of out of the ordinary in order to support your own sustainability oriented purpose, this of course makes it easier for you to walk the talk, not only internally but also in the supplier relations. So there's also this kind of self-stabilizing dynamic. Now we have to add that there's two auxiliary practices that come into play that also kind of are helpful in making this transition. So the one thing is selecting specific partners. On the one hand, partners with an openness to non-economic considerations, and on the other hand, also partners of a similar size, because then they are more approachable by arguments. So the Nature Cost has made the experience that if you have a supply company that is very, very large, very managerial, then you kind of just one number, you cannot reach the decider. And in order to do the purpose work, you actually need to speak to somebody face to face and say, hey, listen, this is about sustainability. Are you in it or not? Kind of. So they go for small and medium-sized, mainly owner-operated companies, because they're the boundary spanners. So the people kind of doing the inter-organizational business are usually the owners, and they simply can decide, okay, this is something we do. And in other organizations, if this is kind of a third-level management employee, they don't have that much agency within their own organization in order to support another organization's purpose, for instance. And the other thing is informal contracting. So interestingly, nature cause kind of departs from a standard in the industry. The standard in the industry is usually that kind of the big cosmetic brands, they have contracts that define all type of fees. If there is some problem here and there, then the supplier is fully responsible. They have to pay kind of huge fees if something goes wrong, and so on and so forth. Nature Cost doesn't do anything of that. They try to avoid formal contracts. I mean, in Germany, there is like the Bundesgesetzbuch, so there's already kind of quite some regulation regarding business relationships, and this informal contracting is important because it leaves a relational void that can be filled with these types of support activities. So for a supplier, it's easier to go the extra mile for a sustainability-oriented organization if they don't have to breach a written contract to their own disadvantage to do so, right? And usually you wouldn't be willing, like the thing that the tax advisor did, like doing stuff for free, you wouldn't write in a contract, this I'm going to do you for free. This, like, it would feel weird. But occasionally, if it appears a purposeful thing to do for you, you would just do it. So this informal contracting is an important thing that enables this purpose borrowing to advance from sensing through sympathizing to actually advancing the focal organization's purpose. So let me conclude, and this is the last slide. That's the good news for you. We're almost here through my broken up monologue, thanks to the internet connection. So what do we take away from this? I would say organizational sustainability happens in the practices of organizations. This is what we have to look at in order to understand how sustainable are they actually. I would say we can also take away that sustainability transitions, they are not necessarily about introducing fancy new practices, but I think this case shows that sustainability transitions is about how you practice your regular business. How are you doing sales? How are you doing supplier management? This is the crux of the sustainability question. If we think about organizations, I would say, and not only sales and supply management, but all basic.
It seems we lost Ignas, hopefully for the last time. But we're waiting for him to reconnect. I can already invite the attendees to start writing down the questions that you have for Ignas in the Q&A box, and then
practices,
we have it ready.
keeping
You're
the
coming back.
I think.
Yeah.
So
the new bullet point, we didn't hear you with in this regard.
Yes.
So the last
Cool.
one. Okay.
Yeah. So I would say a pro-social or pro-environmental normativity in your daily business practices can spark a circular dynamic that enables to continue practicing this pro-social, pro-environmental normativity, right? So this is why we call it kind of an alternative case for sustainability. So there is the possibility that kind of sustainability-oriented practices feed off from themselves in a way through the sustainability enablers that come about as an unintended side effect. And then when environmental goals are being pursued not as a means to the end of higher profit, but as ends in themselves, this is being recognized by collaborating organizations. So they can clearly tell, are you about profits and you use the sustainability thing for it, or are you actually about sustainability? They can tell really easily. And then very often collaborating organizations, especially small and medium-sized companies, find it purposeful to support such purpose-oriented organizations. So there is kind of capacity to summon support from organizations, especially if you think of Germany, of the Mittelstand. There are quite some small and medium-sized companies that are really the backbone of the economy that seem to be pretty open to supporting such endeavors. And purpose-driven and sustainability-oriented organizations, such as Opel social enterprises, they have the potential to contribute to the transformation needed, but too often they have to go against the current in business markets So I would say we need to change the current. And what does that mean? It means that, for instance, sustainability-oriented policies should create better conditions for such organizations. And I mean, of course, it's important to regulate those organizations that are doing a lot of environmental harm, but also keep an eye on summoning the potential of these organizations that really try to push for the transformation and make life easier for them to bring this transformation into practice. Thank you very much. I hope I won't break up again, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you very much, Ignas. Thank you for the insights and for sharing everything. I'm going to invite the participants and the listeners to use the Q&A function now to ask your questions, and then we can ask them to Ignas. And while we're waiting for your questions for the Q&A, I have the first one already by Alavi. And then later on, Ignas, I also have a question for you, so I'll put that back. So Alavi is asking, how would you start a sustainability-oriented discussion for large businesses so that they can actually participate and not end up greenwashing?
I mean, I would say the important thing is to try to get them to a paradigm shift beyond an instrumental approach. So very often in large businesses that end up greenwashing, sustainability is kind of a means to increase profits. And I think trying to get to the paradigm shift that it's not about better business, and that's why we should do sustainability related things, or we should consider sustainability more strongly, but it's for sustainability's own sake. This is like, people have to get this. So I would say kind of make the moral argument and not the business argument. And if they say moral arguments don't have a place in businesses, you can say, yes, they do. But I mean, I think it's really shifting paradigms is not easy, and sometimes, as Kuhn said, in some cases you have to wait for paradigms to literally die out. So maybe it's also like kind of I'm not people dying, but maybe people going into retirement, new generations coming that pursue another paradigm. Yeah, you have to keep bringing the moral arguments, I would say.
Thank you. Serena.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a related question. I found this very fascinating, and the normativity that you looked into. So there's a strong, obviously, ethical connection here, and it's not utilitarian, it's not Kantian, because there's not a right or wrong. So it reminds me a lot about Aristotle and the virtue-based ethics, and what you now said about the paradigms also. So you have to, I mean, this kind of practice is not possible unless you have people who have these virtues, or is it? If people don't want to improve and want to have these virtues, if they just follow rules, or if they just look at a utilitarian way in this, the practices are not going to work. Am I right? What's your
Yeah,
opinion?
yeah, I would definitely say. I mean, in this organization, like regarding the people working there, you have a very strong self-selection. Because I mean they've been founded by a feminist. It was like in the 70s, it was only women working there. It was like totally unusual, right? And with this kind of imprint and legacy, the organization kind of continued to attract people who are very convinced by environmental and sustainability ideas. And so for them, it's taken kind of taken for granted. But I totally agree. I think the interorganizational side of the story tells a little bit more. So there, I mean, these suppliers, this is typical German small and medium-sized companies doing business to business, right? So there, it's not necessarily so much kind of we're an ethically oriented company or something. But still, when they hear the arguments and when they say, I didn't know this was possible in cosmetics, this is a really interesting how many sustainability oriented things you put into practice. This is really great. Yeah. And then kind of if people are convinced that a sustainability transition is needed, then it appears a purposeful thing for them to do. So I think this is kind of more of do we believe in climate change or not type of question. And as soon as the people are on board, it gets easier. But like for the interorganizational practices, I do agree. There, the ethical aspect is definitely something that is very present.
Thank you, Ignas. I'm gonna look back to the Q&A, and Shirin has a question. She thanks you for the presentation and asks whether you could explain the term of informal contracting again.
Yes. So informal contracting means that you simply place an order as if you would buy something in an online shop as a company without a framework contract. So usually in the B2B context, what happens is that first of all, you have like a big contract with many pages defining if this happens, who's paying for that? If this happens, who's responsible? If other eventualities happen, so that you clarify. And usually kind of the original equipment manufacturer clarifies if any problems happen, it's the supplier's fault, the supplier pays for it. And this is what's happening usually. So you have a formal contract explaining how business is going, and then based on that formal contract, you place your first order. And what NatureCast is doing is they don't have such a formal contract defining all these eventualities. They say if a problem occurs, we talk to each other, we get it solved. And then the only thing they do is there is a buying contract whenever just like you would order something online. They don't do any contractual work beyond here's an order, here's your product. That's it. So leaving many more aspects for legally unspecified compared to other cosmetics companies.
Thank you, Ignas. Then Matthias is asking, what would you reckon the most important theories behind what you presented? Background of the question is that we often look for big theories where we can base our research on, and we're happy to learn about established theories. You mentioned Gibbons and Just Kuhn.
Yeah. So theories of practice is what I draw from a lot. So that would be also Ted Schatzky's work. I can highly recommend. In regarding to sustainability transitions, also Elizabeth Shove has done very tremendous practice-based work. So kind of the family of theories of practice or practice theory. And there's beyond Shove and Schatzky and Giddens, there's also Bourdieu and others that can be helpful if you're interested in practices as kind of this supra individual level as kind of your focal point of analysis.
Thank you, Ignas. And I have a question from Kudel, who also thanks you for your presentation and is wondering what you believe this looks like in the Global South context, where the social and environmental priorities are served, but the economic aspect directly underserved.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question, also a tough issue, because the economic aspect is underserved often because of colonial legacies, right? So it's not that in the Global South the economic aspect is underserved per se, but there's a history for that and a reason for that. And the reason for that is that very often, and also until today, Global North companies are profiting from it. So in that question, I think it's difficult to discuss this without bringing in Global North companies' responsibility.
Thank you, Ignas. And then we have a final question from Prashant. And then I have one more very last question. A paradigm shift is never easy, but do you think it's education or regulation that plays a more important role in making it happen, or any other that you think?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's both. I think getting to regulation without education is tough. Of course, we need regulation. This is a very important thing. We cannot simply kind of hand down responsibility to individual actors or organizations. This is a question of kind of institutional ethics, I would say. But in order for this to come about, like, we cannot take anybody out of the equation, right? So there is institutional ethics, there is business ethics, and there's also individual ethics. And we need to chip in. So education, of course, of future business leaders is of great importance. But at the same time, the regulatory processes, of course, like we cannot spare those either.
Thanks, Ignas. So with this, I'm closing the Q&A, and I wanted to ask you, I find there are so many surprising aspects in your work, and I was wondering during the field work, what was the thing that like surprised you the most, and that just where you thought, ha, I never thought that I would discover this.
I don't know. It was, I mean, there were so many so many things. Perhaps the most, I mean, I kind of knew that I'm going there into an organization that is really full on about sustainability. So of course, kind of them kind of discussing, oh yeah, well, again, so many requests like from hotels for hotel cosmetics, we had to reject more than half of them because like from the website you couldn't tell, like there was not a single sign that they're interested in sustainability. So we just said, get lost. So this is kind of somewhat surprising, but still kind of within the bounds of, yeah, okay, one could have expected that. But then like once we got into like the interorganization relations, this was so surprising because it seemed that like these relations were perfectly tailored to the needs of this organization. And this is very unusual. I mean, usually if you're Toyota, then the interorganization relations are tailored to your needs because you're Toyota and you're so big and powerful, and everybody is just doing stuff to please you basically in your kind of supplier network. And there was this kind of this super small company with like super small order quantities, and everything seemed so tailored to them. And kind of it was really as if kind of the whole supplier network was carrying this organization. I thought, how come? Like where is this coming from? And then like one part, of course, was this reciprocity, but then we noticed there's more than that. Kind of then seeing that okay, there's more than this reciprocity element in the relations to these other organizations. That was really very fascinating to discover.
Thank you, Ignas. And then last question for Serena, I think.
Thank you. It's their time, I think. I wanted to ask, I was just curious because we work here on the resource nexus, environmental resources. I saw something early in your presentation about raw material. But then your examples seem to be more like suppliers that already had processed some things. Did you get into examples of suppliers of kind of raw material, and what kind of material would this be?
Yeah.
I don't know the
So
cosmetics that well.
yeah. So kind of the important raw material are usually cold pressed oils from natural ingredients, and these are also the ones that they prefer to source from direct fair trade relationships. So for instance, shea butter from shea nuts, you cannot cultivate shea trees, they have to grow wildly, and so they have kind of a supplier initiative where they said that this is really kind of a tough thing also in the local communities, because usually the men tend to cut down the shea trees and then produce coal from it and sell the coal, and the woman, they go collect the nuts from the shea trees, and it's kind of supporting them, so they generate more income than the men by cutting down the trees in order to keep more trees growing, and in order to show the families that it makes more sense to collect the nuts and sell them than to cut down the trees. So this was one example. And also other types of oil. So these are the important raw materials. And then there are more I would say technical ingredients that you also don't get in certified natural cosmetic quality. So some technical ingredients, they are just in all cosmetic products the same, because there's only like a few big suppliers. So this is something they get through the market. And the most important thing are kind of in natural cosmetics, the natural ingredients. And then the tendency is the more, the better.
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Ignas, for joining us today and giving us a glimpse into your work. It was really interesting and very nice. I would also like to thank the participants for taking the time to listen and to ask questions. I'll take this for a little invitation for all of you to join us for the upcoming Nexus Seminar, which is on June 16th, and Johannes Kuhlmann will be providing insights into his work. And with this, together with Serena, I'm going to say thank you, Ignas, and bye to everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.